These Lunch and Learn programs are made possible courtesy of the Eisenhower Foundation and specifically through a sponsorship by the Union Pacific Foundation. We are very grateful to the Eisenhower Foundation and to you for supporting our programs. If you are interested in participating in the Eisenhower Foundation through memberships or sponsorships or even legacy gifts, please contact Meredith, she's in here somewhere, and she will be delighted to discuss the possibilities with you. Today we get to learn a little bit more about World War I. It's not something we focus on here because we generally connect Dwight Eisenhower to World War II. But many of you know Ike was a young officer during World War I, and he was disappointed at not seeing combat, but he remained stateside in several leadership positions. He was tasked with training the newly formed Tank Corps before they even had tanks. And his next assignment was with the 1919 Transcontinental Motor Convoy. Both of these experiences connect to Dr. Black's talk today, and of course, they are also showcased in our all-new exhibits. Bryan Black received his PhD from the University of Kansas and was integral in spearheading the creation of an environmental studies major at Penn State Altoona. He currently serves as the head of the Arts and Humanities Division. His research emphasis on the landscape and environmental history of North America will inform his talk today on the history and impact of petroleum use. Please help me welcome Dr. Bryan Black.
Hi everyone, how you doing? Good. Well, thanks for coming out, and I'm glad the weather at this particular moment was not too problematic. Thank you to Dawn, thank you to Camille at the World War I Museum as well, where I spoke last night, for bringing me in and for noticing that I had published a piece in the New York Times that is part of what this talk grows out of. If any of you are particularly interested in what I talk about today, I would also mention that one of my publications that I deal with a lot of this in is a book called Crude Reality, which is petroleum in world history, which is used in a lot of, as a supplementary textbook in a lot of world history classes, Crude Reality. And my goal for today is to tell you, people who know a lot about Eisenhower, maybe a way you haven't thought about him before, and to connect with some ideas that I guess the other reason I commend Don and Camille is because part of what I am involved with right now and what I wrote about in the New York Times is what this episode can mean to us and what it means to me. And that gets me into some larger ideas in the telling of history that I'll be introducing you to today. And so I hope I'll be having some big blocks of text up there that you can have time to kind of look over as I read through them and pull out some terms that you might want to ask about later. During the question and answer, I hope that you'll ask about any of those as well as to explore anything about the convoy in particular that you'd like to, since I'll be talking about a variety of things. But thank you very much for coming out. On the morning of July 7th, 1919, a 28-year-old lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, Dwight Eisenhower, set out on a volunteer cross-country road trip to evaluate the emerging system of roadways in the U.S. The convoy's findings were instrumental in charting the priorities that the U.S. would follow over the 20th century. In particular, new sources of power provided logic for expansion and development that was reminiscent of pioneer wagon trains of previous generation. Ike later wrote, "The old convoy had started me thinking about good two-lane highways. This was one of the things that I felt deeply about and made a personal and absolute decision to see that the nation would benefit by it." End quote. In his ensuing experience as a U.S. military leader and president, Ike personalized and personified the American drive to drive, particularly when he oversaw the historic Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Today, as we discern the unique high-energy existence that defined American life during the ensuing decades, this event expands in importance. Understanding our current energy transition from fossil fuels is helped by discerning transitions of the past. Often, events that we already know, such as World War I and the convoy that followed it, emerge with new importance when specifically studied for their role in our changing ideas of energy. Transitions can be seen to derive from a number of different factors, including supply and technological innovation, but they require cultural acceptance and participation to achieve species-altering changes to our existence. Informed by our new knowledge about climate change, scientists and historians have begun to call our current geological epoch the Anthropocene, an era when the action of one species, us, the human, has come to have an impact on the entire Earth. Historians' effort to define the era of the Anthropocene make World War I and even the old convoy stand out as a transformational moment in shaping the domestic economy of the American century. At their foundation, though, the infrastructural priorities that guided this era in the U.S. and derived from Ike's road trip assumed a limitless supply of crude and cleared a right-of-way for a transformative, high-energy existence. As a commodity, black gold reached the first decade and a half of the 20th century in a most precarious and awkward situation. After its discovery in Pennsylvania in the 1860s, and I guess I should add a little footnote here, my first book is a book called Petroleum, which is about the Pennsylvania oil boom of the 1860s, so feel free to look that up yourselves. But massive discoveries after that of petroleum suddenly compounded the world's supply, particularly in the U.S., with the Spindletop strike in Texas in 1901. Various innovations left petroleum, fortunately and ironically though, with only scant utility. Not a lot to do with it, even though we suddenly had a whole lot of it. What factors tipped it from being an increasingly abundant resource to a commodity that spurred a full-blown energy transition? Certainly, personal transportation offered a remarkably rich area of potential global growth. However, the competitive market for powering trucks and cars in the first decade of the 1900s made the internal combustion engine, powered by gasoline, a most unlikely suitor, particularly due to the complex system of processing and delivering that was required for a transition to something like that. Across a spectrum of compounding uses, in fact, the tipping point to alter petroleum's status clearly was the Great War. Providing proper context to World War I requires that historians consider the context that is provided by the resource-based narrative approach that people like me use in the field of environmental history. Of these resources that were transformed by the Great War, energy, and particularly petroleum, which had exploded onto the global illumination market, illumination to make light in the last 4 decades of the 19th century, presents a most revealing narrative. A proper accounting of the war's context must enumerate these applications of the flexible fuel petroleum. However, this is just part of the story of converging technical innovation and cultural desire that results in crude's emerging importance in this era. A variety of global, economic, and regional, political, and social factors converged on the World War I era to catapult the moderately valuable commodity of petroleum to new standards of value, systemization, and competition for access. Indeed, by the end of the conflict, petroleum had become a commodity of global significance, even meriting the term essential. And of course, developing nations therefore needed to consider its accessibility as a matter of national security. in the form of colonization or through the activities of government-supported transnational corporations, access to crude from all over the world became both a requirement and a predictor of global power in the first decades of the 20th century. There's that word I was saying, Anthropocene. In The Origin of the Modern World, a book by Robert Marx, he joins with others in describing the global human of the 19 teens and 20s as going through a great departure. He writes that World War I shook the imperialist order to its foundation and had major consequences for the shape of the 20th century world. The combination of both rapid industrial and population growth in the 20th century redefined humans' relationship to their environment and clearly separated them from the rhythms and constraints of what he calls the biological old regime, the way we used to do things. This energy transition moves from foundational shifts, such as the technology, to create something like synthetic fertilizer for both agriculture and military use in explosives, to also revolutionizing personal transportation. In the case of energy use, we see new technologies of the era provide a shrinking of time and space, as well as an intensification of human impacts and potentialities. In another book, Something New Under the Sun, John McNeill writes that worldwide energy harvest increased by about 5 times in the 19th century and 16 times in the 20th. The Great War sits at a defining precipice of this shift in our species, from deforestation and mining to the expansion of automobile use and the internal combustion engine. We find that the World War I era played a formative role. Indeed, as a divider between 19th and 20th century ways of life, the Great War demarks an entirely new scale and scope to energy use and development. As scholars reorient the human story to better reflect these modal distinctions in the way that people live, World War I also becomes the gateway event to the high energy existence that defines the Anthropocene. In this geological epoch, argues McNeill and others, the human condition becomes one of perpetual disturbance to Earth's natural rhythms and balance. At the core of this existence, he writes, in environmental history, there it is, the 20th century qualifies as a peculiar century because of the screeching acceleration of so many processes that bring ecological change. We have probably deployed more energy since 1900 than in all of human history before 1900. That's one of those factoids that you need to be sitting down to fully grasp the concept of how humanity changed after 1900 in terms of energy use. In addition to the fashion to which energy is applied, McNeill also distinguishes the period of acceleration through the adoption of fossil fuels by a few societies that will begin to industrialize, to develop at an entirely different rate. My Al Gore imitation, if any of you have seen An Inconvenient Truth, but what I'm noting is that this period that we're talking about is right before this huge increase in U.S. field production of crude oil. The energy transition of the World War I era only succeeded because of the advancement of additional technologies that enhanced the impact of new sources of power. Historian Christopher Jones discusses the multiplying effects of such related or ancillary technologies as intensification that took the shift to mineral-based sources begun in the 19th century and formalized and broadened their applications and capabilities. With such new energy systems in mind, the summary impact of the Great War on petroleum usage emerges as many layered and complex but altogether undoubtedly transformative. The stage for this transition, however, was set just prior to the conflict and, surprisingly, did not involve a revolution in personal transportation, which is probably what you were expecting. The imperative of winning World War I had driven the Allies to thrust many unproven technologies into the action with scant preparation. At the heart of many of these technologies was a new prime mover, a source of power, as we call it in energy history. Reading these trends, innovators, including Henry Ford, worked to perfect the internal combustion engine, ICE. And I'll refer to it that way, so don't think I'm talking about ice cubes. Internal combustion engine, ICE. Such an engine combusted petroleum in a controlled fashion and directed its power to engines that could be used for a variety of purposes. Primary among these, of course, was the effort to reliably power engines that would move devices for personal transportation. However, combustion was one of the most glaring vagaries of ICE, with frequent unexpected explosions creating fear among many potential consumers. In addition, though, implementing the requisite and unique infrastructure ranging from filling stations and gas pumps to roads and bridges seemed daunting to society. And in fact, ICE was simply one of the many competitors trying to replace humans' reliance on animal power, which was viewed as incapable of expanding to meet the needs of the modern era. Across the board, early automobiles were an experiment with a very poor reputation for safety and reliability. In fact, electric batteries showed the most promise for personal transport during the transition of the first decade of the 1900s, particularly in urban areas in the northeastern US. Although Ford's Model T, which was powered by an internal combustion engine, made the personal automobile universally available after 1907 at a cost of around $400. In 1912, he and Thomas Edison released the electric version that he believed would define American transportation. However, World War I changed the future of American transportation, and the convoy that Ike participated in played no small part in it. Far from technical infrastructure such as battery charging stations, the World War I battlefront began as a scene from the 19th century. Oxen and horses pulled wagons, and pigeons carried handwritten messages. To win the war, unproven new technologies were released directly onto the battlefield. By the end of the war effort, trucks, tanks, and other devices powered by gasoline, particularly diesel, had supplanted the animal power of the 19th century. The flexibility of ICE, and specifically of gasoline, won the day, and some would say the war. As I mentioned above, though, it was completely separate uses that first brought petroleum to the battlefield. Emerging from the petroleum's initial commercial development in Pennsylvania during the 1860s, subsequent decades brought international development and increased supply, but few new uses. Although the popularity of kerosene had jettisoned petroleum's value in the 19th century, illumination, making light, appeared a fleeting application of crude by the late 1800s, when electricity had begun to be used increasingly for lighting. In both the US and Great Britain, the energy transition was openly maneuvered and manipulated by the political and military establishment. As early as 1910, petroleum emerged as a strategic tool for ensuring global power. The first application for petroleum in this regard was ensuring naval supremacy for these powers. Politically, the British effort at naval conversion was led by young Winston Churchill, who began as a member of Parliament and by 1910 had become the president of the Board of Trade. Although he did not begin on the side of naval expansion, the early 19-teens brought Churchill a clear education on the advantages of oil for naval use, speed capabilities, flexibility of storage and supply, and the ease of refueling at sea. He later wrote, again, this is Churchill, later wrote, "As a coal ship used up her coal, increasingly large numbers of men had to be taken, if necessary, from the guns to shovel the coal from remote and inconvenient bunkers to bunkers nearer to the furnaces or to the furnaces themselves, thus weakening the fighting efficiency of the ship, perhaps at the most critical moment of the battle. The use of oil made it possible in every type of vessel to have more gunpowder and more speed for less size or less cost." By 1912, the policies had been put into place, and as Churchill recorded in The World's Greatest Navy, quote, "The supreme ships of the Navy on which our life depended were fed by oil and could only be fed by oil," the British Navy. The emphasis of Churchill and Britain's military strategists focused on the great benefits for their own naval superiority. However, their decision also marked a defining moment in a new era of the culture of petroleum. By association, committing their fleet to petroleum meant that a consistent and reliable supply of crude had just become one of the most important commodities on earth. Nations' security depended on it. Also, by association, any nation wishing to compete with Britain had to follow suit. By declaring this new energy era, Britain forced any competing nations to also consider oil with this new logic. At the highest level, U.S. leaders debated the implications of converting their own military, particularly the Navy, to petroleum. Their conversations had begun in the late 1800s, but took on greater urgency as British reconversion altered global affairs. The United States had one significant strategic advantage, of course, in the area of naval conversion. In the early 1900s, American oil fields produced approximately 1/3 of all the world's oil. Indeed, the U.S. approached all such strategic decisions from the basic realization that it was the only nation in the world that could power its military with petroleum and largely be able to supply it from its own reserves. It possessed energy autonomy, which would later become known as energy independence. In the end, though, it was Churchill who seems to have most clearly formed the necessary new vision of the 20th century world when he proclaimed to the House of Commons on June 17, 1914, "This afternoon we have to deal not with the policy of building oil-driven ships or of using oil as an ancillary fuel in coal-driven ships. Look out upon the wide expanse of the world, of the oil regions of the world. Two gigantic corporations, one in either hemisphere, stand out predominantly. In the New World, there is Standard Oil, of course, run by Rockefeller. In the Old World, the great combination of the Shell and the Royal Dutch. For many years, it has been the policy of the Foreign Office, the Admiralty, and the Indian government to preserve the independent British oil interests of the Persian oil field, to help that field to develop as well as we could, and above all, to prevent it being swallowed by others. Over the last 2 or 3 years, in consequence of these new uses which have been found for this oil, there is a world shortage of an article which the world has only lately begun to see is required for certain special purposes." I like that term. That is the reason why prices have gone up, and not because evilly disposed gentlemen of the Hebraic persuasion have intended it to be so. Interesting how similar a dialogue he has in this early moment to some of what we hear today. In Great Britain, when Churchill committed the Royal Navy to petroleum in 1913, he forever compromised the nation's energy autonomy. Britain had neither domestic sources of oil nor existing supplies in its colonies. Anglo-Persian BP, with its access to oil in Central Asia, particularly Persia and the future Iran, quickly became the most sensible option to ensure Britain's energy future. Large capital expenditures such as pipeline construction had left Anglo-Persian BP in deep debt and near bankruptcy in 1914. To convince Parliament to help the company, Churchill argued, quote, "If we cannot get oil, we cannot get corn, we cannot get cotton, and we cannot get 1,001 commodities necessary for the preservation of the economic energies of Great Britain," end quote. Parliament approved his plan to purchase a 51% stake in BP for £2.2 million in June of 1914. Maintaining and developing oil supplies obviously had become a critical portion of the British colonial efforts, again, before World War I. Global use of petroleum grew by 50% during World War I, which exacerbated the difficulty of managing the global supply. The catalyst for many of these changes in petroleum culture was conflict on a global scale. In determining humans' transportation future, for example, the brief explanation is simple. World War I relied on the use of vehicles and the electric-powered alternatives that were succeeding in many portions of the consumer market simply could not meet the flexibility required for warfare. During World War I, the manufacture of automobiles for civilian use was virtually halted, as the industry was mobilized to produce vehicles, motors, and other war material for the armed forces. It is estimated that 125,000 Ford Model Ts were used by the Allies on the battlefield of World War I. In addition, truck production was doubled. Even though the American auto and truck industry was required to make other products as well, such as shells and guns, other weapons, increased vehicle needs actually allowed the industry to increase production during the war. Historian David Kirsch notes that in France, Britain, and Germany, as well as later Russia, truck purchasers received up to $1,200 from the government for the purchase of an approved vehicle, which stipulated petroleum, the internal combustion engine powered vehicles, over the electric alternatives of that era. U.S. manufacturers established designs for a standard war truck in 1916, 1917, and consequently began exporting vehicles to the front. Kirsch writes, quote, "The dramatic role of motor trucks in the conduct of the Great War reinforced and accelerated the standardization of the commercial peacetime truck. By 1919, this is a really important statistic. Sorry I didn't put it up there for you to read. This is Kirsch writing. By 1919, electric trucks accounted for less than 1% of the total number of commercial vehicles produced in the United States. That's not so surprising. What he's saying, though, is that 1% in 1919 is down from 11% of all trucks made being electric in 1909, which is a surprising statistic. So in 1909, 11% of the trucks being made in the United States were electric. By 1919, because of the change in war needs, that's down to 1%. Mobility on the U.S. home front was influenced in basic ways by the needs of a war. For instance, in the U.S., the strain on the nation's railroads fueled the military to emphasize long-distance trucking and to call the roads that these routes made necessary. In addition, most trucks for the war effort were manufactured in the Midwest and needed to be brought to the eastern seaboard for shipment abroad. From 1917 to 1918, it is estimated that 18,000 internal combustion engine trucks made this trip from the Midwest to the eastern seaboard. It was these decisions, fed by cheap fuel prices and government-sponsored infrastructure, that helped to determine the future patterns in American mobility. During World War I, having a domestic abundance of crude to manage put the United States in a powerful position, no matter what regulatory choices it made. Writes Daniel Yergin in his famous oil book, The Prize, it was a war that was fought between men and machines, and these machines were powered by oil. When the war broke out, military strategy was organized around horses and other animal participants, with one horse on the field for every 3 men. Such primitive modes dominated the fighting in this transitional conflict. Throughout the war, the energy transition took place from horsepower, literally, to gas-powered trucks and tanks, and of course, to oil-burning ships and airplanes. Innovations put new technologies into immediate action on the horrific battlefield of World War I. It was the British, for instance, who set out to overcome the stalemate caused by trench warfare by devising an armored vehicle that was powered by the internal combustion engine. Once again, Churchill is giving credit for bringing the project, codenamed Tank, to reality when other British politicians wished to continue with existing practices. Although the tank was first used in 1916, its decisive use arrived in August 1917 when a squadron of nearly 500 British tanks broke through the German line. In addition, the British expeditionary force that went to France in 1914 was supported by a fleet of 827 motor cars and 15 motorcycles. By war's end, the British Army included 56,000 trucks, 23,000 motor cars, and 34,000 motorcycles. These gas-powered vehicles certainly offered superior flexibility on the battlefield. However, their impact on land-based strategy would not be fully felt due to the continued prevalence of other methods of fighting. In the air and sea, the strategic change was more obvious. By 1915, Britain had built 250 planes. In the era of the Red Baron and others, primitive airplanes often required that the pilot pack his own sidearm and use them for firing at his opponent. More often, though, the flying devices could be used for delivering explosives in episodes of tactical bombing. German pilots applied this new strategy to severe bombing of England with Zeppelins and later with aircraft. Over the course of the war, the use of aircraft expanded remarkably. Britain using 55,000 planes, France 68,000 planes, Italy 20,000, the United States 15,000, and Germany 48,000. The disagreement over using petroleum at sea helped to exacerbate existing conflict leading up to the war. Ironically, the use of petroleum in ships led to what Jürgen called a stalemate in the use of ships during the war, with only one primary battle going on with that. However, part of this explanation is the great chasm that now separated British's petroleum navy from that of the rest of the world, and particularly the coal-burning one of Germany. It made little strategic sense for Germany to confront the British Navy. Therefore, it used the tactic of submarine warfare. These early submarines ran primarily as diesel-powered ships on the surface, which were capable of briefly diving for attacks while they ran on battery power. When the Allies took renewed measures to prosecute the war in 1918, petroleum was a weapon on everyone's mind. The Inter-Allied Petroleum Conference was created to pool, coordinate, and control all oil supplies and tanker travel. Again, this was in 1918. The United States' entry into the war made this organization necessary because it had been supplying such a large portion of the Allied effort thus far. As the producer by this point of nearly 70% of the world's oil supply, the U.S.'s greatest weapon in the fighting of World War I may indeed have been crude. President Woodrow Wilson appointed the nation's first energy czar, whose responsibility was to work in close quarters with leaders of the American oil companies. These policies began more than a century of close relations between the U.S. government and oil executives, what many of us now call big oil. This explanation of our massive transition to petroleum usage could have stopped on the battlefield, right where we just were. However, with the wartime infrastructure in place in the U.S., the Army's intrigue with the domestic applications inspired efforts to find out if motor cars could stand the trip across the U.S. And they also hoped the convoy in 1919 would function as a demonstration of a new era. More importantly, with proper infrastructure such as roads, could the American public be convinced that the internal combustion engine might actually guide our everyday future? Ike's convoy displayed the new technologies that helped to win the war and also the importance of good roads and bridges, which could only be achieved through the radically new commitment of tax dollars for infrastructure. This intriguing historical event of 1919, put in this context, suddenly emerges as the unveiling of a new way of life for the consumer public. During the convoy, most communities along the trek hosted banquets and ceremonies that celebrated the soldiers in the convoy. Their own veterans, and then they heard speeches about the need for roads and infrastructure to support the new technology. Scouts on Harley Davidson and Indian motorcycles sped a half hour ahead to inspect road conditions and paint arrows to guide the other vehicles. Slippery sand and quicksand outside North Platte, Nebraska, engulfed 25 trucks from the convoy. And in Utah, many were stuck once again in massive sand drifts in the desert. Pavement in California allowed the convoy to return to their top speed of 10 miles per hour. 62 days after leaving Washington, the convoy reached San Francisco on September 5th, crossed San Francisco Bay on 2 ferries, and concluded in Lincoln Park. The log that Eisenhower kept catalogs additional activities at each event, such as band concert and street dancing, while also carefully enumerating specific details of the almost constant mechanical difficulties with their vehicles. The novelty of such travel also compelled amazed participants to record the rate of progress again and again, most of which are very startling to our modern sensibilities. I just pulled out the one from near my home in Bedford, Pennsylvania, from July 9th on the trip, where it says, roads very good, made 57 miles in 11 1/3 hours. During the expedition, Eisenhower gained unique insight of the need for a network of connected roads and bridges. Eisenhower's report to Army leaders focused mostly on mechanical difficulties and the condition of the patchwork of existing roads. He reported a mix of paved and unpaved roads, old bridges, and narrow passages. Narrow roads caused oncoming traffic to run off the road and encountered added difficulty when they tried to re-enter it. Some bridges were too low for trucks to pass under. Eisenhower pointed out that the roads in the Midwest region of the U.S. were impracticable, but the roads in the East were sufficient for truck use. He singled out a western section of the Lincoln Highway, transcontinental road with routes through Utah and Nevada, as being so poor that it warranted a thorough investigation before government money should be expended. He praised California for having excellent paved roads and observed the importance of the road's grade in determining the convoy's success. Would this have been enough to compel such a massive transition in our everyday life? Well, in fact, it didn't need to be, because Eisenhower's education had just begun. It is rare for historians to be able to so clearly trace the development of an idea, a big idea, such as roads and infrastructure. However, Ike followed up his time in the convoy by being assigned to map the importance of French roads for military value in the 1930s. And then, during World War II, he studied and experienced the revolutionary German roadways, the Autobahn network of 4-lane superhighways, probably the best roads in the world at the time. Largely by chance, Ike's military service had brought him a truly rare global expertise on civil engineering and how it could be used to guide national development. As he emerged as U.S. president in the 1950s, Ike created the President's Advisory Committee, known as the Clay Committee, on the National Highway System, which resulted in the grand plan that obligated $50 billion of federal funds over 10 years to build a vast system of interconnected highways. The Clay Committee also warned of the need for large-scale evacuation of cities in the event of nuclear war. If evacuation of urban areas was required because of nuclear attack, the roads could be reversed to make population withdrawal orderly. By the end of the 1950s, the IHS was well on its way to the more than 46,000 miles of roads that it encompasses today. The transformation had occurred in just decades, easily within one man's lifetime. The hidden hand behind the utility of this new national infrastructure was inexpensive fuel. The success of Ike's vision depended on a readily, even thoughtlessly, available supply of petroleum that drove Americans' internal combustion engines. The convoy presents a prime example that energy transitions are no simple flip of a new switch following the discovery or adoption of new sources of power. Competition and influence determined that the ICE would power autos of the future. But that was just the beginning. This energy choice was reinforced and supported by public will, political decisions, and laws such as zoning exerted over decades. Americans determined that the 20th century would be powered by fossil fuels, just as petroleum in the marketplace provided them the flexibility to create a landscape of drive-throughs and filling stations. We wanted it. Over the course of human history, each new energy source marked an innovation in scale and scope. Fossil fuels allowed us to do more work, to accomplish more than ever before in human history. Today, an energy transition beckons that promises not necessarily more power, but a more suitable, smarter future. In short, this revolution is not just in the sources of power, it is also in how we think about energy. Even prior to July 7th, 1919, Eisenhower read the patterns and trends and forecasted that the American future would be built around cheap crude. The oil discovered in Texas and elsewhere allowed his generation to dream a future unfettered by the constraints of energy supplies. Today, the patterns feeding our energy transition are more nuanced, including limited supplies that require political and military and strategic considerations, and clear knowledge that burning fossil fuels gravely impacts Earth's environment. And it is challenging for such a transition to occur organically because vested interests work the levers of government to resist a market-driven transition, such as one could have from the internal combustion engine to electric-powered vehicles. One of the lessons of the 1919 convoy, then, is to demonstrate that energy transitions have occurred in history, and that often they were directed by choices that grew organically from accepted knowledge and new technology. The final lesson of Ike's road trip, then, is to ask, where is our generation's path for the 21st century? How will we find it? How do we ensure that it can break through the marketplace, and which visionary leader will guide us, as Ike did after July 7th, 1919? Thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
This is more of a comment than a question.
Okay.
Family experience. Because of the road construction necessary, my grandfather owned a large road construction company in the teens and 20s.
Oh.
My family came here in 1925 and built roads. As a matter of fact, many of you will remember the Dome Bridge on 3rd Street. His bridge crew built that.
Wow.
And you can imagine, even though he had 200 head of horses and mules, many harness makers and blacksmiths on full time, but you can imagine the slow pace of which road building was taking. And the amount of food, grain that these animals would take, and the care they had to have. 1928, that all changed. Caterpillar came out with their first mass-produced Caterpillar. My grandfather bought 6. Virtually taking the place 10 to 15 horses each.
Wow.
Plus also 2 skinners, because one driver wouldn't quite make it all day, so they had to have 2.
Amazing.
But the pace of that the construction advanced so quickly. As I said, they came here in 1925 on the west, settled in the west side of Abilene, which the property my family still owns.
Excellent.
And the original horse and mule barn is still standing.
Wow.
So, like I said, it was more of a comment.
Oh,
than a
yeah, no,
question,
thank you.
But maybe you could shed some
Oh, yeah.
light on how quickly the pace in the Great Depression hit. And
Excellent.
my granddad went broke at that time.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, the pace of
Thank you. Yeah, and the pace is so extraordinarily different. And I'm sure some people in the room have experience of agriculture in that era as well. And much of what you said in terms of remoting road building could be said for agriculture as well. In either case, we see just radical change in the way we did work. And hopefully you don't get the idea. I'm not a historian who wants to say that there was anything bad about that. That was progress. But in a moment today when I work with college students and they're like, energy transition, oh, that seems impossible. When you hear those moments like you're talking about, you know it's possible. You know it's happened before in the past. And even though it was hard to picture what would come next, Americans really defined themselves, and Eisenhower personifies it better than anybody else, for reaching for that next frontier, maybe not knowing exactly where it was going to work out to come out to. And so we want to make sure that this younger generation in particular approaches its possible futures without fear of a transition or change. But thank you for that comment. I saw at least one hand up here too.
If World War I had not provided the impetus for the petroleum development, what other sources of energies can you foresee would have been developed?
I would say that's like one of my favorite questions because, again, I already kind of showed my hand working with a lot of traditional age college students. Talking to them about energy transitions is a hard thing. And one of my favorite examples is this. I almost went into it when I had the slide up where we were talking about different types of vehicles at the turn of the century, 19th into 20th, because there's this great, almost like a diary entry that was published in a New York newspaper where he's standing on a corner in what would today be Greenwich Village, and he watches 11 different vehicles pass him on the street, each one powered by a different source. That's energy transition, like it was in play, and that was right around 1898. And he itemizes each one, and if you were betting at that moment on the street, another thing I didn't go into very far, you would have bet on the electric vehicle. And I know that it has all sorts of challenges even today when we've brought it back to life. But in that moment, I'd say about 1890 to 1910, batteries and the electric vehicle probably would have been what you would have bet on. And even when you start to think about that, then we see the implications that would have had, because charging stations were not very good. They were available in urban areas, but you had limited range. And so think about all the implications, because the other thing we get with the internal combustion engine is incredible flexibility, no limits to the charging stations of that early era. And so therefore, suburbanization could happen, sprawl could happen. We could put gas stations in far off places. You could make long trips. None of that really could have happened with electric cars at the turn of the 20th century. And so the country would have been very different if it went down that path. But that's the most likely answer that I would say in response to that. And so the change that happens largely, I tell my students, if you want a succinct answer to why we followed the path to petroleum and fossil fuels, World War I's really the quickest answer. And some of it's just because that urgency of warfare, as we talked about in my comments, just demanded that the technology go right into place. And after the war was over, there was just kind of an inertia then to remode that into the domestic sphere. And as I knew all that already, when I rethought Ike's convoy of 1919, I thought, boy, yeah, I never really like totally gave that the credit it probably deserves as almost being the unveiling of this moment. And so that's why I was excited to write the piece this was based on and just kind of put that into a little package to add to Ike's great legacy that he then helped us to move in that direction for the 20th century. Thanks for the comment. Any other questions? Oh, in the back.
Two things I'd like to point out: that over in the museum we do have a 1914 Roush and Lang electric car that belonged to Mamie's parents, and it was driven up until 1946. The other thing I would like to, what role did the railroads play as far as pushing oil? Did they fight against it, or were they looking for a better way to make transportation easier for them as well?
No, that's a great question. Railroads were integral to everything that went on in the early 20th century, and so they were part of this. They were needed for moving the oil around and for getting it to the places where it would be crafted and refined into all sorts of other products. So they were part of the industry. They were part of the infrastructure. Pipelines certainly came along. But what does become interesting, and I talked specifically about the alternatives of electric or gas-powered trucking. It's really during these years that you see the commitment to long-haul trucking, which obviously competed with railroads. Some scholars that I've talked to internationally would say that it was our commitment to trucking and through the interstate highway system era as well that really killed our railroads ultimately. But it was just a choice that we made in terms of transitioning and which fuels we wanted to use and which gave us the most flexibility. So during that early era, I would say railroads were part of the industrial process. And then ultimately, though, as the road systems really improved and trucking became what it is today largely, there is definitely the line of thinking that made Americans pull back on railroad developments that we saw continue in places like Europe and other areas.
If I may ask an actual question.
All right.
If people who know me here, I'm an auctioneer, so I hog the mic. So I also worked for several energy companies for the last 32 years. And one of the things that has came to our attention is every 8 years, the demand for energy doubles. And now with the third world advancing so quickly on needing energy, worldwide it's going to double about every 4 or 5 years. The third world countries do not have the environmental laws that we do, and they are throwing up generators everywhere. What can we do as our government in the United States to safeguard the environment around these generators?
Good for you, and that's a great comment. And actually, I see it in two different ways. I teach during the summers. I teach in Beijing, China, and one of the reasons I do that is one of the courses I teach is energy and world history, and I want to learn what they know. I also want to try to proclaim some things that I would like them to use to organize their own transitions as well. But first off, what you depict in terms of the generators, in terms of the pollution, if I specifically think about the Chinese example, is absolutely true. And the reliance on coal in particular, as we've moved to use coal still, but not in the ways that they still do in cities like Beijing. We do see severe pollution problems. But the other part of that, and I don't think we can have much control over that. We can certainly offer them the technology. I mean, a great example that I tell my students in China is that the first monitor for pollution levels in terms of the air you breathe was put in place, I forget the exact year, but it was about 10 years ago at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And that was the first time that any information was being given to Chinese citizens about the pollution levels. And it happened, it started there, and then the U.S. Embassy was very careful to allow the information to get out to the public, which of course is not what China does. So that kind of information, and now the sensors and things like that have come about, has created a bit of a push for change, a bit of a demand for reform in terms of pollution levels. Now, the interesting thing about that, though, is that I would also say that this is a double-edged sword, because in essence, when I talk to especially young people in China, they are moving into the transition to other types of energy much faster than we are. And that, I think, is should be a concerning thing for the United States, for countries that really rely on traditional fossil fuels, because as China becomes the leader in alternative energy technologies, which it is today, all of a sudden the countries, if you just, what I was reading about 1915, 1917 era, becomes true again, where the countries that absolutely must have fossil fuels in order to maintain their security and their lives could be in a real disadvantage moving into the future when there's scarcity of those kind of resources, because some of the industrializing countries like China and India are going about it in a more diversified method than we can, because it's hard to remode. Whereas they're building a whole new system and they can just do that in a more sustainable fashion, whereas we have to go through the transition of actually changing those things, and that can be much harder. Good question. Oh, got more? Yeah.
Well, I just want to remind everyone that in our newly renovated museum, one of the largest artifacts is a 1913 Lang electric automobile that was owned by Ike's in-laws. I believe it was $4,300 in 1913, which would be like buying a high-end Cadillac Escalade. So Eisenhower was familiar and probably drove an electric car even before he went on the convoy.
That sounds like it should be another essay. Thank you. I didn't think of him actually driving it. Very good.
All right. It's about 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody. Oh, one more question.
I'm happy to answer one-on-one if you'd
Okay.
rather.
Professor, it seems like a lot of environmental issues are rooted in ideology rather than reality. And I think in terms of energy, Americans have always wanted a source that is available, reliable, and mostly affordable. Isn't it true that petroleum is more easily stored and transported and made readily available than electric? And even today, over the decades, we've had trouble today even storing electric energy and making it readily available, charging stations, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder how many of those electric vehicles in 1909 were used in urban areas where electricity may have been available, but how practical would that be to a largely rural and agricultural nation?
Great question, and the way you phrased all that, you've thought about this and you know a lot. And I think that's how we need to look at energy transitions, is that it comes down to economics. It always does. And it's a cost-benefit equation of one sort or another. What I want to make sure of, though, is our added challenge today, which I didn't go into with too much depth like I do in some other writings and talks, but if that is an equation, what do we do with the information of the costs of climate change, of the impact of pollution? How does that get included in that equation of economics? Because ultimately, one of the challenges to our energy transition right now is what seems to us like intimidating economics to do anything about climate change. And that is a really hard thing to look into and make a decision to change. So I guess I totally agree. I just think that as we have more knowledge, we need to figure out what to do with it. And I don't think that's settled. I don't think we know. I think that's one of the things that's interesting about our generation, is that we're the first ones to have that knowledge of the outcomes of using fossil fuels. And so we become the generation that says, okay, what do we do with that knowledge? Does that mean that we go ahead and use a cheaper source today, even though on down the road it's going to cost us one way or another? Or do we try to make some augmentation to how we're living right now that will hopefully help that eventual cost be lower? One of the really fascinating things right now is that not every country is dealing with it the same way. And that's problematic. You would love it if humanity could just get on the same boat and make a decision. That's not how it's going to happen. And even once a nation, let's say the United States, for instance, makes a decision and seems to be going on a certain path, politics can come in, ideology as you call it, to really change the view of that equation. So it's not settled. And we're in for a wild ride. And what I think, I don't necessarily want to leave you with this thought, but it probably is the best place. With the younger generation in particular, I feel a lot of times they're almost at a moment of stymied indecision. They don't know what to do. And so they're not doing anything right now about making that change. And that I would like to see be more empowered by an organized collective vision of what we want to do and what we want to be like in the future. Because as we learned from earlier energy transitions, even if we just look at global competition, our standing in the world really depends on energy, as you put it, supplies of energy. And that doesn't just mean only what we can pull out of the ground, because now we have a lot more knowledge and we know that it's a bit more nuanced than that. So it can be a little more complicated, and maybe that's what the future generation will figure out. Thank you so much. I'm happy to talk to you individually, and have a great day.
Thank you.